trafficking in Thailand and Cambodia. The trafficking of humans for purposes of slavery has reached epidemic proportions. The International Organization for Migration recently estimated that over 200,000 women from Southeast Asia are trafficked to other countries annually, making this region the largest source of trafficked women in the world. And in fact, it's not just women who suffer from this, but children and men are also trafficked both into and through Southeast Asia for purposes of sexual slavery, forced labor, domestic servitude, and most notably in Burma, child soldiers. NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, are actively working to combat human trafficking in this region, but little research has been conducted as to how these organizations function or whether or not they actually have the impact that they say they're having. So one way to approach researching NGOs is to look at their communication processes and their rhetoric. And one of my research questions focuses on how do NGOs narrate the issue of trafficking to the world. So I've conducted 2 research trips to Southeast Asia. The first was in 2009. I worked at an NGO up in the north called Development Education Organization, or Program for Daughters in Communities, up in Chiang Rai on the Burmese border. And this is a local NGO that is run by Thai nationals. I was actually the only foreigner working there at the time. And I taught music and English to the girls while doing research on the sort of operations of the NGO. And this NGO is dedicated to child trafficking prevention. And what I did was I studied the way trafficking interfaces with culture and national identity, because the ethnic minority children are at the highest risk of being trafficked. They don't have rights under the Thai government. They don't have citizenship rights because they don't speak Thai. They're denied health care and education and things like this. And they're the most disenfranchised community. So in the summer of 2010, I took a second research trip to Thailand and Cambodia with USC's Center on Communication Leadership and Policy in partnership with the State Department's Office of Innovation under Secretary Clinton. And the focus of the research for this project was on finding technological solutions to combat trafficking. We went to Thailand and Cambodia, a colleague and I, because specifically they're designated Tier 2 countries by the State Department. And what the State Department does is they publish what's called the Trafficking in Persons Report. This is an annual report that basically does a report on every country in the world assessing whether they're complying with the United States Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. And also the UN Protocol to Suppress and Prevent Trafficking. And if you're more interested in this, you can actually read the TIP report online. But Tier 2 countries such as Thailand and Cambodia have made significant efforts to combat trafficking, but they still have a long way to go. So for example, the US is a Tier 1 country. We do a lot to try to combat trafficking. Places like Burma and the Congo are Tier 3 countries. Thailand and Cambodia are making efforts, so they're kind of in the middle, Tier 2. So our goal was to assess how technology might help anti-trafficking NGOs function better. And to do this, we interviewed 15 NGOs in Thailand and Cambodia asking questions about their communication processes. But again, what interested me most about this trip was the rhetoric that the NGOs use to communicate the reality of trafficking and to narrate trafficking to the world, and how this rhetoric situates the organizations politically. So this is the part that I'm going to go through really fast because it's very academic, and if you want to ask me questions about it later, please do. But I started looking through interviews with the NGOs and their promotional materials, also their pamphlets and their online presence. I started looking at the rhetoric through the lens of 3 communication scholars. One is Walter Fisher's narrative theory. Fisher basically says stories narrate the world. They narrate our experience. I looked at Kenneth Burke's dramatistic theory. He uses something called the scapegoat principle, which I can tell you more about if you're interested later. And then Black's rhetorical theory, and Black talks about the auditor defining the identity of the rhetor. So in other words, the audience kind of defines what the rhetor is saying. So in this case, it would be donors, governments, and publics actually kind of helping to define what the NGO is saying. So through these interviews and through the promotional literature and my analysis, I observed that NGOs spend a lot of time constructing an image of their beneficiaries. They call them victims. in order to, in my mind, kind of inflate their position in the discourse. They also, what we found was they called the women girls overwhelmingly. So it wouldn't really depend on how old, wouldn't matter how old the woman was. She could be 15, she could be 30, but she was still referred to as a girl. And I'm speaking about Western international NGOs operating in Thailand and Cambodia, not so much the local ones. The promotional literature also relies very heavily on testimonials from the women. So in other words, stories that the women tell about how they got to the NGO and how they were rescued by the NGO. But these testimonials aren't, overwhelmingly, they aren't in the actual voices of the women. Instead, they're translated and they're filtered through the lens of the NGO. A scholar named Erin talks about the right to narrate. To me, this interfaces with the NGO setting an agenda about which stories it deems worthy of being told. And the underlying assumption here is that the NGO actually has the most credible voice in the trafficking discourse. So these rhetorical frames relate to a broader theory, in my mind, about where NGOs are situated in the global public sphere. We're going to sort of jump a little bit to a different theoretical idea. The scholar Manuel Castells talks about the global public sphere being a place between government and civil society, a place where actors come together on different levels, citizens, NGOs, governments, to ideally collaborate on global issues. And I see NGOs as having a very complicated sort of position in this global public sphere, because on the one hand, we assume that they're not part of the state. On the other hand, they often work with the state in collaboration on different levels, and they represent different interests. And my theory is actually that these organizations have three representational categories: state interests, cultural interests, and institutional interests. So NGOs, again, we think about them as not being part of the state. We think about them as being these sort of beneficent, trying to do good, and they have nothing to do with governments. But in fact, that's not true. An example being in 2009, one very large international anti-trafficking organization received funding from the State Department to conduct its research on trafficking in Southeast Asia. But there's been really no, to my knowledge, monitoring of how they're doing their research, where they're getting their numbers, where they're getting their statistics. However, the State Department really needs this information because, again, it's producing these tip reports every year. They have to they have to get content for their reports. So they rely very heavily on NGOs to help provide them with the content, but not a lot of it is monitored. So NGOs represent state interests. NGOs also represent cultural interests. Some of them uphold religious ideology and actually work to try to convert beneficiaries. I don't think this can be understated. They also promote individual freedom, Western Enlightenment-based notions of justice. So we need to understand them we need to look at them through a cultural lens as well. And finally, NGOs represent their own institutional interests. In this sort of neoliberal, global, free market economy, the NGO has to think of itself first. It has to do the books, it has to get funding from donors, and it has to be competitive in the market. So each of these positions, the state, the cultural, and the institutional interest, influences and is influenced by the NGO's communication processes and their rhetoric. The way they narrate the problem of trafficking and the way they construct the voices of their beneficiaries and the way they market themselves serves to uphold their identities in the global public sphere. We can talk a little bit more about that if you're interested. But I'll end on one note that to my mind, having done this research and been there several times and seen the very different ways that the NGOs work and the lack of monitoring and the lack of understanding points to the need to really understand NGOs in order to better understand the problem of human trafficking and how it's being dealt with worldwide. In order to assess the effectiveness of NGOs working in the tip space, we must first understand how these actors are situated, how their communications processes reinforce their roles in the global public sphere. And research on the role and scope of NGOs will help further illuminate the complexities of the transnational crime of human trafficking. Thank you.